My name is Jordan Rivers, and 6 years ago, my own brother tried to kill me. Not in a moment of blind rage or temporary insanity, but in a calculated attempt to eliminate what he saw as an obstacle to his inheritance. The irony of our last name wasn't lost on me as I fought for my life in the murky waters of Lake Harrison that October evening, struggling against both the freezing current and my brother's hands pushing me deeper beneath the surface. But I survived. More than that, I came back stronger than I'd ever been before. The story begins long before that night at the lake, rooted in a family dynamic that had been toxic for as long as I could remember. My brother Marcus was 3 years older than me, and from childhood, he'd harbored a resentment that grew darker and more dangerous with each passing year. We were the only children of Harrison Rivers, a successful real estate developer who had built a small empire of commercial properties throughout the Pacific Northwest. Our family history was one of achievement built on a foundation of emotional neglect and psychological manipulation. My father had grown up poor in rural Oregon, the son of a logger who died in an industrial accident when my father was 12. That experience of sudden loss and financial instability had shaped his entire worldview, creating a man who believed that success was the only protection against life's unpredictability. Harrison Rivers had built his real estate empire through a combination of shrewd business instincts, calculated risk-taking, and an absolute refusal to accept failure in any form. By the time Marcus and I were born, he owned commercial properties worth tens of millions of dollars, but his wealth had come at the cost of every other aspect of his life. Our mother, Elizabeth, had divorced him when I was 8 years old, citing emotional abandonment and his obsessive focus on business success. After the divorce, Marcus and I spent our time alternating between our mother's modest apartment in Seattle and our father's sprawling lakefront mansion. The contrast between these two worlds was stark and confusing for children trying to understand their place in the family hierarchy. With our mother, we experienced normal sibling relationships, shared responsibilities, and unconditional love. With our father, we were competitors in a contest that would determine not just our inheritance, but our fundamental worth as human beings. The competition began early and intensified with each passing year. Our father would compare our report cards at family dinners, highlighting not just our individual achievements but the relative differences between our performances. If Marcus scored 90% on a math test and I scored 92%, the focus would be on my superior performance rather than on celebrating both of our successes. This pattern extended to every aspect of our lives. Sports competitions, academic achievements, social skills, and even physical appearance became subjects for comparison and judgment. Our father kept detailed records of our accomplishments, creating charts and graphs that tracked our relative progress in various areas. Looking back, I realize he was treating his own children like investment portfolios, constantly evaluating our potential returns and adjusting his emotional investments accordingly. Our father was a demanding man who believed in competition as the driving force behind achievement. He pitted Marcus and me against each other from an early age, constantly comparing our grades, our athletic performances, and our business acumen as we grew older. What he intended as motivation became a source of deep psychological damage for both of us, but it affected Marcus and me in completely different ways. I responded to the pressure by trying to excel in everything, hoping to earn my father's approval while maintaining a relationship with my brother. I worked twice as hard as necessary, achieved academic honors, excelled in swimming and track, and eventually earned a degree in business management from the University of Washington. Despite my achievements, I always felt like I was falling short of some impossible standard that my father had set. Marcus, on the other hand, developed a burning jealousy that consumed him from the inside out. He was intelligent and capable, but he couldn't stand the fact that his younger brother consistently outperformed him in areas that mattered to our father. Instead of using that competitive energy to improve himself, Marcus channeled it into finding ways to undermine my successes and tear down my confidence. The competition became more intense when our father announced his succession plans for the family business. Harrison Rivers' development was worth approximately $50 million, and our father had always intended to leave the company to whichever son proved most capable of running it. He'd structured his will so that the more successful son would inherit controlling interest in the business, while the other would receive a smaller financial settlement but no operational control. By the time I was 25 and Marcus was 28, it had become clear that I was the likely heir to the business. My ideas for expanding into sustainable development and mixed-use properties had impressed our father, while Marcus's more traditional approach seemed outdated and uninspired. I'd also developed stronger relationships with our key clients and contractors, many of whom specifically requested to work with me rather than Marcus. The final straw came when our father suffered a mild heart attack and was forced to accelerate his retirement timeline. Instead of waiting several more years to make his succession decision, he announced that he would be stepping down within 6 months and naming his successor. The writing was on the wall. I was going to inherit control of Harrison River's development, and Marcus would be left with a substantial but secondary role in the company. That's when Marcus's resentment evolved into something far more dangerous. The plan he devised was both simple and terrifying in its calculated cruelty. Marcus knew that our father's will contained a clause stating that if either son died before the succession was finalized, the surviving brother would automatically inherit the entire business. He also knew that I was an excellent swimmer who frequently trained alone at Lake Harrison, a remote body of water about an hour outside Seattle where our family had owned a cabin for decades. Marcus had been watching my training schedule for weeks, learning my routines and identifying the perfect opportunity to strike. I typically swam laps between 2 floating docks on the lake's north shore, a distance of about half a mile in each direction. The area was isolated, especially during the late fall when most recreational boaters had stopped using the lake for the season. On the evening that changed everything, I'd driven out to the lake for what I thought would be a routine training session. I was preparing for a triathlon competition the following spring, and the cold water swimming was helping me build endurance for the event. Marcus had told me he was working late at the office, reviewing proposals for a major commercial development project. What I didn't know was that Marcus had left work early and driven to the lake using a different route, parking his car in a hidden spot about a quarter-mile from the cabin. He'd changed into dark clothing and swimming gear, preparing to intercept me during my training session when I would be most vulnerable. The water temperature was 48 degrees Fahrenheit that evening, cold enough to be dangerous but not unusual for my training regimen. I'd been swimming in cold water for years, and I understood the safety protocols for avoiding hypothermia and maintaining core body temperature. I'd also informed my training partner, Sarah Martinez, about my schedule, though she wouldn't expect to hear from me until the following morning. I was about 20 minutes into my swim, halfway between the 2 docks, when I first noticed something was wrong. I'd been maintaining a steady pace, focused on my breathing and stroke technique, when I became aware of another swimmer in the water nearby. At first, I thought it might be another athlete who'd had the same idea about training in the lake, but something about their movement patterns seemed deliberately stealthy rather than recreational. The other swimmer was approaching me from behind and slightly to the right, using the darkness of the evening and the choppy water surface to mask their approach. I slowed my pace and tried to get a better look at who was sharing the lake with me, but the figure was wearing dark clothing that made them nearly invisible in the water. That's when Marcus struck. He came at me from below, grabbing my ankles and pulling me under the surface with a sudden violence that caught me completely off guard. I'd been floating in treading water, trying to identify the other swimmer, when I was suddenly dragged down into the cold darkness of the lake. The shock of the attack was almost as overwhelming as the physical assault itself. For a split second, I couldn't process what was happening. I thought perhaps I'd been caught in some kind of underwater current or had somehow become entangled in debris. But then I felt hands gripping my legs and arms, deliberately holding me beneath the surface, and I realized that someone was trying to drown me. My survival instincts kicked in immediately. Years of swimming training had taught me how to hold my breath for extended periods and how to remain calm in challenging water conditions. But this was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I was fighting not just the water, but a determined attacker who was using my own environment against me. I managed to break free from the initial grip and surface long enough to take a quick breath before being pulled down again. In that brief moment above water, I caught a glimpse of my attacker's face and experienced a shock that was even more devastating than the physical assault. It was Marcus. My own brother, the person I'd grown up with, competed with, and despite everything, still loved, was trying to murder me in the cold waters of our family's lake. The betrayal was so profound that for a moment I almost stopped fighting, overwhelmed by the emotional impact of realizing that my brother wanted me dead. But survival instinct overrode emotional shock, and I began fighting with everything I had. The struggle that followed was unlike anything I could have imagined. Marcus was larger and stronger than me, but I was a better swimmer with superior endurance and water skills. He had the advantage of surprise and murderous intent, but I had the advantage of experience and the desperate motivation that comes with fighting for your life. We grappled underwater for what felt like an eternity, a silent, deadly dance in the dark water. The physics of underwater combat are fundamentally different from fighting on land. Every movement is slowed and distorted by water resistance, making it difficult to generate the force needed for effective strikes or escapes. The cold was numbing our extremities, making it harder to maintain grip strength and fine motor control. Marcus kept trying to hold me under until I drowned, using his weight advantage to pin me beneath the surface while I fought to reach air and escape his grip. His strategy was brutally simple: maintain contact and pressure until I lost consciousness from lack of oxygen or hypothermia. My strategy was more complex, requiring me to use superior technique and water skills to create opportunities for escape and counterattack. The cold water was sapping both of our strength, but my years of cold water training gave me a crucial advantage in maintaining core body temperature and mental clarity. I'd spent countless hours swimming in conditions that would have incapacitated most people, learning to control my breathing, manage my heart rate, and maintain cognitive function even when my body was approaching its physiological limits. But this wasn't just a test of physical endurance, it was psychological warfare conducted in an environment where survival depended on split-second decisions and absolute commitment to violence. Marcus wasn't just trying to overpower me, he was trying to break my will to resist, to convince me that death was inevitable and that I should stop fighting. The most terrifying moments came when he managed to wrap his legs around my torso while holding my head underwater, creating a position where I couldn't surface for air no matter how hard I struggled. In those seconds, I could feel consciousness beginning to slip away as my oxygen-starved brain started to shut down. The edges of my vision began to darken, and I could hear my heartbeat becoming irregular as my body desperately tried to conserve oxygen. But each time I reached that critical point, survival instinct would surge through me with an intensity that overcame physical limitations. I would find reserves of strength and determination that I didn't know existed, fighting with a ferocity that surprised even me. The combination of adrenaline, desperation, and years of athletic training created a physiological state where pain and exhaustion became irrelevant compared to the imperative of staying alive. At one point, Marcus managed to wrap his arm around my throat in what I recognized as a chokehold designed to render me unconscious. If he succeeded, I would drown before regaining consciousness. Drawing on techniques I'd learned in self-defense classes, I managed to break his grip by driving my elbow backward into his solar plexus, causing him to release me and surface gasping for air. But Marcus wasn't giving up. He came at me again, this time grabbing me by the hair and trying to force my head underwater while using his legs to kick at my torso. The violence of his attack was shocking. This wasn't a moment of temporary insanity, but a sustained attempt to kill me with his bare hands. That's when I made the decision that probably saved my life. Instead of continuing to fight defensively, I went on the offensive. Using my superior swimming skills, I dove deep and came up behind Marcus while he was looking for me on the surface. I grabbed him around the waist and used my momentum to drive both of us underwater, but this time I was in control of the dive. I held him under for several seconds, just long enough to demonstrate that I could drown him if I chose to, before releasing him and swimming away as fast as I could toward the nearest dock. Marcus surfaced behind me, coughing and gasping, but he didn't pursue me further. Perhaps he realized that his surprise advantage was gone, or perhaps the cold water had sapped more of his strength than he'd anticipated. Whatever the reason, he let me swim away while he made his own way back to shore. I reached the dock in a state of shock, both physical and emotional. My core body temperature had dropped dangerously low during the prolonged struggle in the frigid water, and I was shivering uncontrollably as I pulled myself onto the wooden platform. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the psychological trauma of realizing that my brother had just tried to murder me. I wrapped myself in the emergency blankets I kept in my gear bag and sat on the dock for nearly an hour, trying to process what had just happened. My first instinct was to call the police, but I knew that proving attempted murder would be nearly impossible. It would be my word against Marcus's, and he could easily claim that we'd simply had a swimming accident or a playful wrestling match that got out of hand. Instead, I made a different decision. I decided to disappear. Not permanently, but long enough to let Marcus think he'd succeeded in drowning me. I drove home in the darkness, avoiding main roads and taking care not to be seen by anyone who might later testify about my whereabouts. I packed a bag with essential supplies and drove to a remote cabin owned by my training partner Sarah, who was out of town for a family emergency. For the next 2 weeks, I let the world believe that Jordan Rivers had drowned in Lake Harrison. Marcus reported me missing after I failed to show up for work, playing the role of the concerned brother perfectly. Search and rescue teams dragged the lake looking for my body, while my father grieved for his lost son and began making arrangements to transfer control of the business to his surviving heir. But I was very much alive, and I was planning my return. During those 2 weeks in hiding, I gathered evidence of Marcus's financial troubles, his gambling debts, and his desperate need for money that would motivate him to kill his own brother. The investigation revealed a pattern of increasingly desperate behavior that painted a clear picture of someone spiraling toward violence as a solution to his problems. Marcus owed nearly $200,000 to various gambling establishments and loan sharks, debts that had accumulated over 3 years of compulsive betting on sports events and casino games. His credit cards were maxed out, his bank accounts were overdrawn, and he'd already borrowed against his expected inheritance to cover previous gambling losses. The interest on his debts was compounding daily, and his creditors were becoming increasingly aggressive about collecting what he owed. I discovered that Marcus had been stealing money from Harrison Rivers Development for months, using his access to company accounts to cover gambling debts and living expenses. He'd been careful about it, taking small amounts from different accounts and covering his tracks with creative bookkeeping, but the cumulative theft totaled nearly $50,000. If discovered, this embezzlement would have resulted in criminal charges and immediate termination from the company. The pressure had been building for months before the attack at Lake Harrison. Marcus's gambling addiction had progressed to the point where he was betting money he didn't have on increasingly risky propositions, each loss driving him deeper into debt and closer to the kind of people who solve collection problems through violence. His creditors had begun making explicit threats about what would happen if he didn't pay, threats that included physical harm to both Marcus and anyone close to him. I also developed a comprehensive plan to expose his crime and ensure that he would face justice for what he'd done. The plan required patience, technical expertise, and a willingness to let Marcus believe he'd gotten away with murder long enough to gather irrefutable evidence of his guilt. The key to my plan was technology. I installed hidden cameras and recording equipment throughout the family cabin at Lake Harrison, knowing that Marcus would eventually return to the scene of his crime. Criminals often feel compelled to revisit the locations where they've committed major crimes, partly out of paranoia and partly out of a psychological need to confirm that they've gotten away with their actions. The surveillance system I installed was far more sophisticated than anything a typical homeowner would use. I positioned cameras with night vision capabilities in multiple locations around the property, creating overlapping fields of view that would capture activity from any angle. The recording equipment was hidden in weatherproof containers buried throughout the property, ensuring that even if Marcus discovered some of the cameras, he wouldn't be able to destroy all the evidence. I also installed audio recording devices that could pick up conversations from considerable distances, using technology typically employed by law enforcement agencies for surveillance operations. These devices were disguised as natural elements of the landscape, fake rocks, artificial tree bark, even a bird feeder with a built-in microphone that could capture clear audio from anyone standing near the lakeshore. I also set up a sophisticated surveillance system that would monitor Marcus's communications, including his phone calls, text messages, and email correspondence. Using techniques I'd learned from a cybersecurity consultant who worked with our company, I was able to access Marcus's devices remotely and record any conversations or digital communications that might provide evidence of his guilt. The breakthrough came 8 days after my supposed death, when Marcus returned to Lake Harrison alone. Hidden cameras captured him walking to the exact spot where he'd attacked me, looking out over the water with an expression of satisfaction that made my blood run cold. But more importantly, he made a phone call while standing at the water's edge. The call was to his bookie, confirming that he would be able to pay off his gambling debts as soon as his inheritance was finalized. During the conversation, Marcus explicitly mentioned that his brother's death had solved his financial problems and that he would soon have access to the family business and its assets. It wasn't a direct confession to murder, but combined with other evidence I'd gathered, it painted a clear picture of motive and opportunity. I also had medical records documenting the injuries I'd sustained during our underwater struggle, including bruises and scratches that were consistent with being attacked by another person. 2 weeks after my supposed drowning, I walked into the offices of Harrison Rivers Development during a board meeting where my father was finalizing the transfer of company control to Marcus. The shock on my brother's face when he saw me alive was captured by security cameras and provided compelling evidence of his guilt. An innocent person would have been overjoyed to see their supposedly dead brother alive and well. Marcus looked like he'd seen a ghost, which, from his perspective, he had. The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. I presented the evidence I'd gathered to my father, the company's board of directors, and the police detectives who were still officially investigating my disappearance. The recording of Marcus's phone call, combined with the financial evidence of his motives and the physical evidence of our struggle, was more than enough to support criminal charges. Marcus was arrested on charges of attempted murder and insurance fraud. He'd actually filed a claim on a life insurance policy that named him as the beneficiary of my death, providing additional evidence of premeditation. The trial that followed was relatively brief, as Marcus's defense attorney advised him to accept a plea bargain rather than risk a much longer sentence if convicted at trial. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison for attempted murder, with the possibility of parole after 8 years. But the legal consequences were only part of the justice I sought. The real victory was in how the experience had transformed me from a victim into someone who was genuinely stronger than I'd ever been before. The physical training I'd undergone to survive that night in the lake became the foundation for a complete transformation of my approach to life. I'd always been a good swimmer, but the life-or-death struggle with Marcus had pushed my abilities to levels I'd never thought possible. The experience had taught me that human beings are capable of far more than they typically realize, but only when faced with circumstances that demand absolute commitment to survival. I began training even more intensively, not just for athletic competition but as a form of therapy that helped me process the trauma of the attack. The repetitive nature of swimming laps, the meditative quality of maintaining rhythm in breathing, and the gradual building of physical strength created a framework for psychological healing that traditional therapy alone couldn't provide. My training regimen became increasingly challenging as I sought to replicate and exceed the physical demands I'd faced during the attack. I practiced swimming in cold water, holding my breath for extended periods, and maintaining cognitive function under stress. These exercises weren't just about building physical capacity, they were about proving to myself that I could handle whatever challenges life might present. The psychological benefits of this intensive training were profound. Each time I pushed through a barrier that had previously seemed impossible, I gained confidence not just in my physical abilities but in my capacity to overcome adversity in all areas of life. The man who had nearly drowned in Lake Harrison gradually disappeared, replaced by someone who understood his own strength and resilience. Within a year of Marcus's conviction, I'd completed my first Ironman triathlon, finishing in the top 10% of my age group. The mental toughness I'd developed during those terrifying minutes underwater translated into an ability to push through physical and psychological barriers that would have stopped me before the attack. The race became a celebration of survival, a public demonstration that attempted murder had made me stronger rather than weaker. But the transformation wasn't limited to athletic achievements. The confidence I'd gained through surviving the attack and rebuilding my physical capabilities extended to every aspect of my life. I began taking on leadership roles within Harrison Rivers Development that I'd previously avoided, speaking at industry conferences, and pursuing business opportunities that required significant personal risk. The experience had also changed my relationship with fear itself. Before the attack, I'd been motivated primarily by a desire to avoid failure and disappointment. After surviving attempted murder, I realized that most of the things I'd been afraid of were trivial compared to the ultimate fear of death. This perspective shift liberated me to pursue goals and opportunities that aligned with my values rather than my anxieties. I also developed a much deeper understanding of human psychology and the dynamics of family relationships. The betrayal I'd experienced from Marcus forced me to examine my own assumptions about trust, loyalty, and the nature of sibling rivalry. I began working with a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery, learning techniques for processing difficult emotions and building healthier relationships. But perhaps most importantly, I discovered a sense of purpose that had been missing from my life before the attack. Surviving Marcus's murder attempt had given me a profound appreciation for the fragility and value of life. I began using my position at Harrison Rivers Development to support causes related to victim advocacy, trauma recovery, and family violence prevention. The company began partnering with organizations that provided housing for domestic violence survivors, building safe, affordable housing developments that were specifically designed to meet the needs of people escaping dangerous situations. We also established a foundation that provided financial support for families dealing with the aftermath of violent crimes. My father's perspective on family and business changed dramatically after learning about Marcus's attempt to kill me. The competitive dynamic he'd created between his sons had nearly resulted in the death of one child and the imprisonment of the other. He began working with family therapists and business consultants to develop healthier approaches to succession planning and family dynamics. Sarah Martinez, my training partner who had provided the cabin where I'd hidden during my supposed death, became much more than just an athletic colleague. Our shared experience of supporting each other through physical and emotional challenges evolved into a romantic relationship built on genuine trust and mutual respect. She'd been one of the few people who'd never completely believed that I'd simply drowned during a routine training session, and her intuition about my survival had proven correct. The transformation in my physical abilities was matched by an evolution in my mental and emotional strength. The experience of fighting for my life against my own brother had stripped away many of the fears and limitations that had previously held me back. If I could survive attempted murder by someone I'd trusted completely, I could handle whatever other challenges life might present. I began taking calculated risks in business that I'd previously avoided, leading to innovations that significantly expanded Harrison Rivers Development's market presence and profitability. My willingness to embrace uncertainty and push boundaries came directly from the confidence I'd gained by surviving the worst thing I could imagine experiencing. The physical scars from that night at Lake Harrison faded over time, but the psychological transformation was permanent. I'd discovered reserves of strength, courage, and resilience that I'd never known I possessed. The boy who'd always sought his father's approval had become a man who defined success on his own terms. I also developed a much deeper appreciation for the support systems that had helped me survive and recover. Friends like Sarah, professionals like my therapist and legal team, and even strangers who'd participated in the search and rescue efforts had all played crucial roles in my survival and recovery. This recognition led me to become much more active in building and supporting community networks for people facing various types of crises. The annual triathlon competition that had motivated my training became a platform for raising awareness about family violence and supporting survivors of assault. Each year, I dedicated my race to the memory of victims who hadn't survived attacks by family members, while also celebrating the strength of survivors who had overcome similar traumas. Marcus's time in prison wasn't wasted. He eventually began participating in therapy programs designed to help violent offenders understand and address the root causes of their behavior. Through letters mediated by counselors, we began a very limited and carefully supervised process of communication that focused on accountability and healing rather than reconciliation. I never forgave Marcus for trying to kill me. That level of betrayal was beyond forgiveness. But I did reach a point where I could understand the psychological pressures and character flaws that had led him to attempt murder. This understanding didn't excuse his actions, but it helped me process my own feelings about family, competition, and the destructive potential of unchecked resentment. The business that Marcus had tried to inherit through murder became a vehicle for preventing similar tragedies. Harrison Rivers Development began incorporating family counseling and conflict resolution services into our employee benefits packages, recognizing that workplace success often depends on healthy family relationships. We also became advocates for legislative changes that would provide better protection for victims of family violence. My relationship with competitive swimming evolved from a personal pursuit into a platform for advocacy and education. I began speaking at schools and community organizations about the importance of recognizing warning signs of family violence and the resources available to people in dangerous situations. My story resonated particularly strongly with young athletes who often face intense family pressure and competitive dynamics similar to what I'd experienced. The technological surveillance techniques I'd used to gather evidence against Marcus led to an interest in cybersecurity and digital investigation methods. I began working with law enforcement agencies to develop better tools for investigating domestic violence cases and documenting evidence of family-related crimes. The hidden camera system that had captured Marcus's incriminating phone call became a model for helping other victims document abuse and threats. 10 years after that night at Lake Harrison, I stood on the same dock where I'd fought for my life against my brother's murder attempt. But instead of reliving trauma, I was celebrating the completion of a major milestone, the opening of the Harrison Rivers Family Safety Center, a comprehensive facility that provided counseling, legal assistance, and emergency housing for families affected by violence. The center was built on land donated by our company, designed with input from survivors of family violence, and staffed by professionals who understood the complex dynamics of familial abuse. It represented everything I'd learned about turning trauma into positive action, about using survival as a foundation for helping others. Sarah stood beside me on the dock, now my wife and business partner, as we watched children from the family center learning to swim in the same lake where I'd nearly died. Their laughter and splashing represented the transformation of a place of trauma into a source of healing and empowerment. Marcus had been released from prison 2 years earlier, after serving his full sentence and completing extensive rehabilitation programs. He'd moved to another state and had no contact with our family, which was appropriate given the severity of his crime. But reports from his parole officer indicated that he was working steadily, participating in ongoing therapy, and making genuine efforts to build a different kind of life. I didn't wish him ill, but I also didn't want him in my life. Some betrayals are too profound to overcome, even with time and therapy. The brother who'd tried to drown me in Lake Harrison no longer existed in any meaningful way. Marcus had killed that relationship as surely as he tried to kill me. But from the ashes of that destroyed relationship, I'd built something much stronger and more meaningful. A marriage based on genuine partnership rather than competition. A business that created value for communities rather than just extracting profit. A life dedicated to helping others find their own strength in the aftermath of trauma. The water that had nearly been my grave had become a source of renewal and transformation. Every time I swam in Lake Harrison, I was reminded not of how close I'd come to dying, but of how much strength I'd discovered in the process of fighting to live. My name is Jordan Rivers, and 6 years ago, my brother tried to kill me in the cold waters of our family lake. He failed, and in failing, he gave me the greatest gift of my life, the knowledge that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined possible. I came back from those depths not just alive, but truly living for the first time.